appreciate that very much. Actually, today's the best day I've had with it, so I do appreciate it. Several have offered to prop us up. That's the way I would say it. And I'll be propping up. I appreciate that. So everybody knows, let's get it out of the way. I sprained my ankle this time last week. Did not think it was too bad. Got surgery in several weeks. We had to go to the doctor. So we're hoping the boot will get us out. Do appreciate your attendance this morning. Appreciate everyone being here, and I trust that you've come praying that the Lord would see fit to meet with us this morning and bless our efforts to worship Him in spirit and in truth. In a moment, we're going to go to the Lord in prayer. Vice Brother Kenneth Riddle, if he will, to lead us in public prayer this morning. As you, I'm sure, are all aware, Brother Azariah had surgery postponed yet again due to an infection that he has in his lung. So let's remember Brother Azariah and Sister Lindsay. I've never been where you are, Brother Azariah, but I know it's got to be a very difficult thing to keep having this pushed out, and so we certainly want to keep you on our prayers. Is there anything you want to tell the church about?
No, just keep me in your prayers, I guess. I've been a sinner this past week.
So am I, brother.
I know. I blamed God for what's happened. I've been upset at Him. I was like, man, this sucks. And it did a little bit, but it wasn't even. Well, I'm not going to compare myself to other people because that's nonsense. No matter what, I should trust in God, and I failed a little bit at that. So, if you would keep me in your prayers, obviously, I'm trying to get back on track.
Yes. I mentioned a coworker last week that was in grave circumstances. She did pass away yesterday evening. I've asked you to remember that family and their time of loss. And you work with people, you end up spending more time with them than you do your own family oftentimes. And she was a very important part of our organization. But more than that, she was just a delight to be around. And so I'd ask you to remember our work family as well. Are there others you'd like to mention in a particular way?
I do.
Yes, sir.
I have a friend that I'm not going to name because he hasn't told me it yet. Mm-hmm. He's expecting a child and expecting it to not be alive whenever it comes out. So if you would ask God to heal the child and be with the family.
Yes, sir. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
I asked for prayers for my first cousin back in January. I just got an update yesterday. He had a bleeding ulcer that has had major complications. He's ended up with 4 drains, of which they've only been able to remove 2. And he's been on a popsicle diet since January. So if you continue to remember him in prayers, they go to the doctor and hopefully get some positive answers this week.
Anyone else? We covered an interesting prayer this morning, the time that we stand before you, that the word of the Lord will go forth and be glorified, and that we as the body of Christ might be edified in the preaching of the gospel. If there's nothing further, Brother Kenneth, would you lead us in prayer?
Our gracious Heavenly Father, we come before you, Lord, begging interest in your mercy, Lord. Yes, you be with those mentioned today, Lord. Those sick and afflicted, heal them if it be thy will. Be with this young couple that's been mentioned, that's expecting a child. Protect the child. Heal if it be thy will. And either way, Lord, we ask that you grant peace to the family. Yes, you be with the Morrows, Lord, this sweet couple. Be with Brother Azariah, that he may feel lifted up and be healed. Grant peace to his family, Lord, and be with his brother William also. Watch over him. shower of mercy. We ask this time also that you may give us this time to put those things out of our minds for a little bit, Lord, and be with the servant of yours that comes before us, Lord, that he may bring a message that will make us feel lifted up and be honoring to thee, Lord, that we may see you more clearly. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
I do try not to read anything in the Bible from the pulpit, but I am going to read an article of faith this morning. Appreciate the song service this morning and the good on prayer that's gone up. Appreciate you, brethren, when you remember the things that we forget to mention. In your prayers. Want to take our text to start with this morning out of Exodus chapter 20. And I want verse 11, but it's in the middle of one of the Ten Commandments, so we'll start in verse 8. He says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." So right here in the middle of really almost smack in the middle of the Ten Commandments, the writer of Exodus, Moses, by inspiration of God, reminds us that God created the earth, that he created the sea, and everything that is in them, and he did it in 6 days. Our article of faith, that's number 3, it says, "We believe the biblical account of creation. Creation being a sovereign action of God through the power of his word alone. That is, God spoke the universe, including this earth and all life therein and thereon, into existence in 6 24-hour days, finished and rested on the seventh, and upholds it all by the same." Right here in the middle of Exodus, and we'll find it throughout the Bible, the creative power and the creative genius of God is on display. And right here in the Ten Commandments, it's interesting to me, there's a school of thought out there that says that, okay, I'm a Bible believer, I believe in God, and I believe the Bible, but I just believe that the days in creation were thousands of years long. And there's a text where Peter says in one of his letters that a day is with the Lord is 1,000 years. And those folks will run over to that text and take that text and say, you see, each of those days was 1,000 years. So it was really 6,000 years he created the earth. And then he rested for 1,000 years after that. I do not subscribe to that belief. I'm going to say at the outset, I will give you a lot of latitude in your beliefs on creation, a lot. Because we don't really know with specificity some things. So if the Bible is not specific, then and you have a view that doesn't impugn the integrity of God, or doesn't cast aspersions or cast doubt on his word, I'll go a long way with you and allow you to have that belief. But sometimes common sense must dictate that we stick to the plain reading of Scripture. And when he says here, surely that if the 6 days of creation were anything other than 6 literal 24-hour days, surely Moses right here would have alluded to that. And not just have said, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth. What kind of day was Moses talking? He said, so what often is the case is folks will say, well, in that day, those days were different. Well, what were the days in Moses' day like? I think they were pretty much like the days we have today. And so when Moses said in 6 days, he's referring to 24-hour days. Or he would have said, for in 6 days like there used to be in Adam's day, when it was 1,000 years to a day, that just doesn't hold water. So we're going to stick with the 24-hour day when it comes to these. Now, what was it? Somebody said, well, but what was an hour in Adam's day? Was the earth moving faster or slower? I don't know. If you want to think that the earth was moving faster or slower and that a second was not the same as it is today, that's one of those. I'll give you that latitude. That's fine. You're going to run up against some pretty significant problems with that if you carry that to its logical conclusion, but that's okay with me. I'll just tell you what my view is, since we're kind of new to each other still. I'll just tell you my view of it. I believe it was 24 hours just like we have today. I believe it was that the pattern of the day was established, in fact, right there in Genesis. So let's go back to Genesis and take a look at what the Bible has to say about this miracle of creation. And it is indeed a miracle. God did not take things that already existed like we might do. We might take, I've seen some paintings people have done, and they're beautiful. They're wonderful, and we might call those the creation of theirs. But it's really, when we create things, what we're doing is we're taking things that already exist, and we're changing them or combining them or sometimes taking away from them to put forth something that might be in our mind or something that might be in our imagination. But we're not taking things that don't exist and making them exist. And that's what God did in creation. He took things that did not exist and made things that did exist. And he didn't make the things that exist out of things that didn't exist, or other things that did exist. Put it that way. I hope that made sense. I get tired. I get tank hunger, when I start thinking about those kind of things. The Lord spoke the worlds into existence. So let's go back to Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1, we begin, guess where? In the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. I got a question this week I thought was an outstanding question. I love to get questions that show that people are really thinking. And the question was, in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, I guess it is. I'll have to look. It might be 1 Corinthians. But regardless, the question stands. That when Paul said that he was caught up, that he knew a man that was caught up. I happen to believe it's the Apostle Paul talking about himself there. Although I readily acknowledge with the experience that he had, his making an allowance for the fact that he didn't really understand exactly what happened to him. But he says he was caught up to the third heaven. You want to know what the third heaven was? I'd like to cover that today. I'd like to talk to you about what the third heaven is. But before we talk about, let me back up. Can I submit to you that the third heaven existed before the first heaven and the second heaven did? The first heaven and the second heaven were created here from someone, from God, who existed in the third heaven already. And we'll get to that. When he says here, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, what he's referring to when he says heaven is the expanse of the universe. He created the universe in which we live. I get often amused when I will read an article, and they come out every 3 or 4 years, I wonder about how God views our discoveries sometimes. We discover a new planet, or we discover a new whatever, and or a new star or whatever, and I wonder if God's this is pure imagination on my part. God didn't sit there and go, yeah, well, they finally found that one. You know, I didn't know how long it was going to take them, but they found it. Of course, he did know. But, you know, and that's foolishness to think of. But I just wonder about that. They'll say, these articles will say, universe larger than initially thought, or universe bigger than last discovered, or whatever. Well, yeah, it is. You're not going to find out God. You're not going to search the universe and find out God. I get, when you go the other direction, I get amazed. You know, for years and years, people didn't really understand what the building blocks of matter were, and then they found molecules, and they thought, well, that's the smallest thing here is a molecule. And then a little while later, they said, wait, no, that molecule is not the smallest thing. It's actually an atom. An atom is the smallest unit of matter. And then they dug a little deeper, and microscopes got a little smaller, and they kept a little further in, and they found something that are called protons and neutrons and electrons, and those make up atoms. And then they dug into those protons and neutrons and electrons a little bit. They found something they called quarks. And then I read an article not too long ago that said that, you know, they've now identified subquarks. And I suspect if this world endures long enough, one of these days they're going to have to come up with another name for the subquark so that they can have a subquark. You know, because you're just not going to find out God's creation. God's creation is miraculous. You're not going to ever find the building blocks because he didn't use building blocks. He spoke things into existence. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The heaven under consideration there is the expanse of this universe. That's the second heaven. Then, a little bit later on, he's going to say, and I thought about just reading all this, but I'm not, I might, but I don't intend to this morning. But he's going to come down here, and he's going to create something called the firmament. And that to me is kind of an unfortunate English word. It's perfect, you understand, because it's in the Bible. But it's unfortunate from my understanding. Because when I think of firmament, I think of that dirt you're seeing out there. I think of the rocks. You know, my yard's full of rocks. Tammy and I talked about getting out and picking up the rocks. But if we ever decide to do that, we're going to need some help. Because there's a lot of rocks in our yard. We didn't have a lot of rocks in the yard back in Mississippi. We had a lot of clay and a lot of sand, a lot of mud. But we didn't have a lot of rocks. But that's what I think of as the firm ground on which we stand just from a natural standpoint. But the firmament here really is referring to the first heaven, which is the universe not the universe, the atmosphere that we see. So the first heaven is the earth and the atmosphere that surrounds the earth and makes it habitable. And I want to try to come back to that, the habitability of the first heaven. But that's the first heaven, where the birds fly, and you're going to find out that's where the birds fly. You want to know what that heaven is, it's where the birds fly. Do the birds fly in what we would refer to as outer space? No, they do not. They can't survive out there. There's no oxygen there. But here, God has built a place perfectly suited for the birds to fly in the air. Perfectly suited in air for us to breathe. Perfectly suited for human beings to live. And I am convinced by the Bible that it is the only place in this universe that is suitable for human beings to live. I am also convinced that this is the only universe that God created. And I've had those kind of questions. Well, how do you know God didn't create another one? Because I believe he would have told me about it if he did. I believe we'd have some record of it if he did. I can go to Isaiah 45, Psalm 115, Acts 17, and point you to places that they don't say it outright, but they tend to point me directly to this habitable place as the only one for God's people to live. And that's where we are. That's the first heaven. The second heaven is when you slip the surly bonds of earth, as the poet said, and you get outside of the atmosphere of the earth, where it is not suitable for human life. That's going to be your second heaven. Angels can live there. They don't have a problem. not people, without big rocket ships and things like that. Suits designed. What is that suit? When an astronaut goes on a spacewalk, what does that suit do for them? It takes a little of the first heaven with it, and that's what sustains them when they're out there, when they're up in those spaceships, if you will. The firmament is this terrestrial ball and the atmosphere that surrounds it. And that's the first heaven. The second heaven is outer space. And the third heaven, the one that Paul was so mysterious about in his language, is the abode of God itself. He's been inhabiting that. In fact, in Isaiah 57, he says, it is he that inhabiteth. So in Isaiah's day, he said, it's God that inhabiteth. And right now, Isaiah says, while I'm writing this, God is inhabiting eternity right now. That's where that third heaven is, where we all expect to be someday. So you got the firmament. And the rest, we'd like to kind of dwell on the firmament. I used to like to talk about light a lot from the pulpit. Because in my career and in my education, I have worked with and studied light probably as much as anything else. And I love the biblical applications of light. But I've tried 3 or 4 times to preach on that from the pulpit and go into some of the wavelengths and the spectrums and all the beauties of the mathematics and things like that. People just really don't appreciate that very much. So I'm going to spare you this morning. Let's just say there are some very beautiful analogies that you can find when you study light and the ways that it behaves. Wave theory and particle theory. All these things. I promise I won't do that. But I do want to get this one little point about light. When God said, let there be light, God did not create light. In fact, light was never created. Now, somebody's probably out there going, wait a minute now, Brother Tom. He said, let there be light. He created light right there. I would challenge you to go over to 1 John chapter 1 and verse 5, where John says that God is light. And bounce that off of and try to reconcile that with the view that light was created. If God is light, are we willing to say God was created? I can't go there. So, but I'll tell you what he means when he says, let there be light. What he is saying is, let light be manifested. Let it be reflected. Because you don't see light until it's reflected. If I had one of those little laser pointers, I had one of those little laser pointers, and I'm not going to get one, but if I had one, and I pointed it over there at that wall, the light coming out of that laser, it would exist from here all the way to the wall. But you know where you would see it? You'd see it on the wall. Why is that? Because there's nothing between here and the wall to reflect it. But when it gets over there, that wall will reflect that red or green or whatever color laser light. This suit and this tie. Elder Charles Sanders told me this one time. He was a science teacher. I got a lot of analogies from him. I love to just sit and talk to him and pick his brain about things. He said, if I was wearing a blue tie that day, he said, my tie's really not blue. I said, well, Brother Charles, it looks awful blue to me. What color am I? Am I colorblind? I know that happens. I didn't know I was colorblind. It looks blue to me. He said, no. He said, that tie reflects blue light. So you're seeing it. It absorbs everything else, and it reflects blue light. So when God said, let there be light, what he was doing is he was telling his creation to start reflecting his glory. It's that simple. So God goes through and he has created the firmament, and then he separated. And this is interesting to me. This is again where I'll give you a lot of latitude. We have taken our children over the years, and I went as a child. I had a grandfather that lived really close to Washington, D.C. We would go see him. We'd go to the Smithsonian museums. And we've taken our kids to the Smithsonian museums. They're wonderful places to go. You can learn a lot there. all I will tell you is, as my father in the ministry used to say, you got to eat the chicken and spit out the bones, because you're going to read some things. There's some bones there, and they'll have a sign beside them about how many millions and billions and trillions and however many whatevers of years ago that particular animal lived. And when we would take our children, they'd say, "Well, Dad, we don't believe this. I mean, we don't believe that." So here's my explanation about that. I don't hesitate to go to those places. They're fine. Because here's what occurs to me. Hebrews chapter 11 tells us that by faith, in other words, without faith, you can't do this. By faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the Word of God. If you understand, if you read the Genesis account, and when you read it, you go, well, of course that's how it happened. You know how you do that? By faith. That's because if you believe in the creation, that is one of the evidences that you are a born-again child of God. It's because you believe that God spoke these things into existence. But you go, so you go in those museums and you'll find those plaques, and they'll tell you that this Brachiosaurus, or whatever he lived 25 billion years ago, or whatever it is. I don't commit those kind of things to memory because I don't believe them. But if I did not have faith, and let me be very charitable here, what if I have faith, but I'm not willing to use it? I may be a born-again child of God, but I've sat in so many science classes with so many very convincing men and women that stood before me and taught me that, the universe came into existence because some cosmic event happened and life came where there was no life. And they've convinced me that somehow or another, even though they can't really tell me what the first catalyst ever was, but they've convinced me, and I take my faith and I put it on a shelf and I say, you know what? I'm just not going to use it. I choose to believe this evolutionary account. If that's the case, if I either don't have faith or I refuse to use it, what those folks present at that museum makes perfect sense. It's the next logical thing. You got to come up with something. We're here. How did we get here? Well, without believing in God, without there being a creator God in the mix, how did we get here? And that's as good a solution as any I ever heard of. That some single cell organism somehow slithered out of the swamp and became a thinking, functioning human being somewhere down the road. That's as good as any I heard of. But if you have faith and you're willing to rely upon it and say, you know what? I don't know exactly the process, or I don't know the mechanism that the world came into existence. Here's what I know. I know that God made something out of nothing. And from that point, I can read this and all of it makes perfect sense. So I can go to that museum and say, yeah, you know what? I see these bones all here, but you know what? I gotta have some other explanation. Well, here's my explanation. Okay? Since I think you ought to know this about your pastor. You may think, well, I wish we'd known that before we called you pastor. But I'm going to tell you what I understand scriptures to teach about those things. In verse 9, Genesis chapter 1, verse 9 says, and God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. Well, but let's back up at verse 7. And God made the firmament, which divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. You know, we still see that. If you look out right now, if you look out that window right there, you're going to see some water that is above. And if you go over to Beaver Lake, you'll see some water that is below, sandwiched right between. Now, I'm going to tell you what I understand. There was a great, the world that we live in today is not the same exactly as the world that Adam lived in. And here's why. Because in some way, there was those clouds, that water that was above the firmament, there was in some sense a protective barrier around this earth. Now, some have said it was ice. Some have said it was a vapor canopy. I don't care which you call it. It was water of some sort. Because the firmament divided the waters above from the waters that are beneath. Remember when in Noah's day, when Noah built the ark that God commanded him to build? You know, it wasn't Noah's ark. It was the ark that God commanded him to build. And I guess from that sense, we can call it his ark. But you remember when the Lord went in and shut the door, or when Noah went in and the Lord shut the door, you remember how there were 3 sources of water that flooded the earth. Someone says, well, there couldn't be a global flood because there's not enough moisture on this planet to cover, say, Mount Everest or Mount Rainier or whatever the highest peak is. There's not enough water, not enough moisture to do that. Well, sure, there's not now. But see, in that day, there was a water above. So the 3 sources, it rained 40 days and 40 nights. And then, well, let me back up a minute. It was a global flood. Okay? There's some says, well, that was just a local kind of flood. But you know, I can't say that. Most world civilizations have some sort of historical reference or some mythological something to a global flood. Right. The Bible's is just not mythology. That's right. It really happened. And I suspect theirs was rooted in something that their ancestors knew really happened. But it rained 40 days and 40 nights. The fountains of the deep were broken up. You ever seen a wellhead or a spring? There's still fountains under there. And then it says that the window of heaven was open. Which heaven? The first heaven. The window of heaven was open, and all that water that had been up there in the sky came down. Now that did 2 things, at least 2 things. One thing it did is it helped flood the earth. And all manner of creature, every land-dwelling creature died, except for 8 souls that were saved by water. Why? Let's just cover this real quick. I can't go back to preacher, can't miss this one. Why was Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their 3 wives? Why were those 8 people? Or how were they saved? Was it because Noah was obedient and did what God told him to do? Was that why? Did God look down and say, okay, well, Noah, since you built the ark, everybody was laughing at you and wondering what you're doing, but since you were obedient, I'm going to go ahead and put you in there and save you. Is that what happened? No. It's very simple and it's very profound. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. It was nothing that Noah had done, nothing that he would do. Noah simply found free, unmerited favor in the eyes of the Lord. He went into that ark, which was a box, by the way, not a boat. It's a box. And God shut the door. God had commanded him to take 2 of each kind of animal, male and female, for obvious reasons, and 7 of the clean animals so he could sacrifice them. He didn't have to go get a German Shepherd and a Pit Bull and a Chihuahua and a Dachshund or whatever. He just took a dog. He didn't have to go get a lion and a tabby cat and a whatever. He just took a cat. And when they came off the ark, they populated the earth. But once he shut the door, that vapor canopy came crashing down. Now, so one thing it did was it helped flood the earth. There is too much evidence in the rock strata that show a cataclysmic flood. I have been in, Sister Tammy and I went out to the Grand Canyon. We've been out there twice now, and it's fascinating. But the folks usually that put on these talks, they're not, that I can't say if they're Bible-believing people or not. We don't get into those kind of discussions. But they don't present that generally as biblical. But I pick up the science that they present always. If it makes sense, it jives with the Bible. Don't mind me using the word jive, dude. Sorry. It jives with the Bible. It makes sense. I'll have to, this is for a different day, but I'll have to tell you sometime about the relationship between the Native Americans or the natives, indigenous peoples, whatever you're supposed to call them these days, that were in Arizona during that flood and the Egyptians. There's a pretty good tie there. But anyway, so one thing it did was it flooded the earth. And that canyon, if you think about the volume of water, I got some concrete at the house we just moved into, and the water comes off of the roof and it hits that concrete. I've got to do something there because it's already showing me the aggregate underneath the cement. I mean, it's wearing that down, and that's just after a few years. With just a little trickle of water coming off of the roof. Think about the bazillions of, that's maybe a real number, the many gallons of water that all of a sudden when the water abated, all that water had to go somewhere, and it took rock and stuff with it when it went. And that created that canyon out there. I love going out there for that reason, if no other reason. That's one thing that vapor canopy helped do. But here's the other thing. Prior to that time, you remember how long men were living at that time? Because we're about 1,600 years into the creation. The flood happened about 1,600 years after the creation. So at that point, men are living. The flood happened, was it in Noah's 600th year? Men were living to as long as the oldest one we have recorded. Someone says, well, Methuselah was the oldest man that ever lived. We don't know that. What we do know is he's the oldest one we have on record. He lived 969 years. So that vapor canopy that was up there, it was protecting the earth from the UV rays and other harmful rays of the sun. So things didn't age. Right now, I'll tell you, Sister Tammy and I bought a camper a few years ago, and the guy that sold us the camper, he told us, he said, listen, you need to put it under a shed. I said, and I thought, yeah, it might hail. He said, no, hail's not your problem. I said, well, yeah, if it rains on it enough, you could see how the rain's not your problem. So what is the problem? The sun. He said, the hardest thing on your camper is not the water, it's not the ice, it's the sun. The sun, if it sits out in there day after day after day, the harmful UV rays of the sun will destroy your camper. Happens to us too. That's why we have dermatologists. That's why I have to go every so often to the dermatologist, get her to look at me, see if any new things popped up she's got to take off. The sun, and you'll notice this, you'll notice immediately after the flood, the most prominent character that lived after the flood is who? Abraham, right? How old did Abraham live? 175 years. That's it. And you're going to see after the flood, you're going to see the lifespan of men drop off till it gets back to where Psalm 90, where Moses, who wrote the 90th Psalm, tells us it gets to 70 or 80 years. That's where we are. Somebody says that the dinosaurs, what killed the dinosaurs? I think the flood killed the dinosaurs, but not in the way you might think. I think after that flood, those flood water, and it's a big if the Triceratops really looked like the artists think it looked, I'm not convinced that's the case, but if it did, there was two of them on the ark. But once they came off the ark, the world was different than it had been before. They didn't live very long. So you want to know, again, you need to know this about your past. You want to know what I think killed the dinosaurs? The sun did. Because it had greater access to the earth after that vapor canopy was removed. Men didn't live as long after that. In fact, in Genesis chapter 6, right before the flood, you're going to read about something. This question comes up every now and then about something that is called the Nephilim. Y'all familiar with that term? I hope you're not. I really hope you're not. But that's the Hebrew word that is used to describe those in Genesis chapter 6, verse 2, 6, verse 4. It's only there twice. That's what the word that's used to describe when the sons of God took wives of the daughters of men. Now, I'm going to tell you, I will promise you, my explanation of that is not going to be satisfactory to you. I know it's not, but it's my explanation nonetheless. So here's the deal. They were giants. But if you look at that word, if you look at the word, and you remember what Genesis 6 tells us, that the thoughts of the imagination of man's heart was only evil continually, you know what else that word Nephilim means besides giant? It means bully. They were bullies, and they were bullying people. That's our human nature, you know. But I don't deny that there were giants in the land. We know that Goliath, we tried to preach a little bit about Goliath last night. We know that Goliath was a giant. By our terms anyway, from 9 feet tall, it's pretty big. Here's what occurs to me. If today, let's just say that our lifespan, just to make the math easy, let's just say that our lifespans are 100 years. Okay? Now if you get to 100, you're doing good. I've known some people that made it to 100 and you don't get there, it's not for the faint of heart. But let's just say you get to 100 years of age. And so for the first 33 years or so, you grew. Now, that's a little bit of a stretch. We're going to go with that. Just, again, make the math easy. If you want to try math in the pulpit sometime, you're welcome to. So a third of your life you spent growing. And then you really sort of start shrinking after that. And I know I've experienced that. I know some of you probably have as well. Think about it if you're living to be 1,000 years old. If you apply that same proportion, you're going to grow for about 333 years. I think you could get pretty tall in that time frame. I mean, that's why there were giants in the land. Men of renown. And even after the flood, those genetics came out. And you still had some giants after that. Didn't last long because the world was different after the flood. But the world that God created right here, notice that he says this over and over again. So I just wanted y'all to know all these things. That's the way I explain all this. It's not an exciting view. It's not a fancy view. It's just pretty straightforward. That's my view of it. I've got some science to back it up, a lot of scripture to back it up. But at the end of every day of creation, what does God say about his creation? It's good. It's good. It's good and very good. Even after he created man in his own image, he says it's good. Our next article of faith, which I thought about maybe combining with this one, but I don't think I will right now. But our next article of faith is going to be largely about it going south. But right now, I'm just going to dwell on the good. So God created, and on the last day, so I love that. We sing this song. I called this song out particularly for the last song, and I know many object, and I object to the thought. I'll give poetic license on the song, but who flung the stars out into space? And I've seen some versions of that say who placed the stars out. It wasn't something haphazard. But I will give the author some poetic license because when the Bible, I think it was 3 days earlier, God said, "Let there be light." It's interesting to me that on that third, I can't remember if it's third or fourth, but you go back and read it, he created the sources of the light. That's kind of interesting to me. But he created the lesser light to rule the night, the greater light to rule the day. And the evening and the morning created the day. So, then there's a little blurb in the Bible. I mean, I shouldn't really describe it that way. It's a little blurb to me, but it's very, I'm sure it's there for a reason. It says he made the stars also. As though it was almost an afterthought to say, oh yeah, I made those two. So if God speaks about him that way, I'm going to give the author a little license. Who flung the stars out into space? That's fine. I think he's the stars that we've been able to identify. I think God placed them there very specifically and purposefully. I understand that, but I'll cut him some slack. Who flung the stars out into space? So he created all these things, and if you know just a little bit, just one more little thing about light, as far as we've identified stars being out there, and one of the arguments against the creation account is that, well, if he created those stars, it would have taken so many years for that light to travel through space to get here. Well, see, they missed the first few verses. Because it says he said, let there be light first. I mean, light was there already. He didn't have to, he just put the stars out there as the source of it. He'd already manifested the light. It's no problem for God. So he's created all these things, and in the first 5 days, he's created the earth, he's created the universe, the earth, he's created the whales, which are literally translated sea monsters, by the way. He created the cattle, he created the trees, and he created all of these things. He didn't create an acorn that would grow into an oak tree. He created an oak tree that would produce an acorn. And somebody says, well, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, for the Bible believer, it's not a problem. The chicken came first, no doubt. And then the chicken produced eggs. It's no problem for the Bible believer. But 5 days, he created all of this stuff that we see. And on the 6th day, and I may have told you all this already, but I'm a firm believer in this. Why do you think? I mean, that's sort of the magnum opus, right? I mean, that's God's creating this. When he creates this thing, he's going to create it in his image. He's going to create his image. And he waits until the end. Why? Why would he not have created man first? And then let man see all his creation? It's because not causing that man to fall, but knowing that that man was liable to fall, he knew if he created Adam in the very first day, that Adam would have found a way to take credit for the rest of the days. But I love the way he did this. He takes Adam and he puts Adam in his place. Because so Adam is so he did not make Adam out of nothing. He made Adam out of something he'd already created. The dust of the ground. Now, you don't get much lower than dust. One of my favorite newspaper cartoons, the man's passed away now, is a cartoon called BC. And there's a BC cartoon in which there's a snake crawling on the ground, and the snake in the frame spits out, coughs up like a dust bunny. And one of the characters there says to the parson that's next to him, says, serves you right. Or the parson says, serves you right. And the man standing next to him says, oh, you have no compassion on your fellow creatures? And he says, I've read the Old Testament, buddy. So he's saying that snake deserved that dust bunny is what he's saying. Look at what he got us into here. Which he didn't exactly get us into it, you understand. He created man. When that serpent was cursed in chapter 3, on his belly would he go? You know what's under the snake's belly? The dust. God took the lowest thing that there was to create us out of, forever putting us in our place. And he remembers that. There's a couple of songs that tell us he remembers that we're dust. He knows our frame. He remembers that we're dust. He knows what he made us out of. And we would do well to remember what he made us out of. That in ourselves, in our natural being, we have no glory of our own, as the songwriter said. We have no glory. If we were to try to take glory, we'd be faced with the realization that we're just dust. And it took the in-breathing, miraculous, God-given power to breathe into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And then he placed man and gave man dominion over the earth. Isaiah 45 and 18, he tells, Isaiah 45 and 18, I don't think I can get the quote exact, but bottom line is he says there that he gave man the earth. We have the responsibility. Now, I realize many have taken that too far. But we do have a responsibility. We have a responsibility of stewardship to this planet in which we live, and we should be kind to it. We should try to do our best to take care of it and what have you. Now, again, that can be easily, it has been in many cases taken too far, but we should be good stewards of it. But he gave man dominion over the plants, dominion over the animals. We used to have an old deacon at Middleton Creek, legendary. And I remember he used to go hand grabbing. He wanted to take me hand grabbing for catfish, or y'all, some people call it noodling. And I was a young guy back then. I thought, yeah, we'll give it a try. And we did. We gave it a try. Caught a few fish. And you know what? As far as I'm concerned, I've checked that box, and I don't have to do that anymore. I'm not in no way am I an adrenaline junkie. But we had gone. My brother-in-law and I had gone hand grabbing, and short version of the story is we came to a spot where some guys sitting on the bank, and in retrospect, they were probably just fooling with us. But we saw these guys on the bank, they saw kind of what we were doing, and I don't think they liked it too much. And they said, oh, y'all haven't seen that alligator, have you? And I got to thinking about that. Here I am treading water out in this creek and going down and searching these holes out. And if I see that alligator, I am in his natural habitat. I don't think I can outswim him. I surely can't outfight him. So I got out and I walked on the bank for a while after that. I think it's the last time I ever went. I was telling Brother Alfred about that. Brother Alfred said, that alligator wasn't going to bother you. Don't you know God gave man dominion over the animals? I said, yeah, but I'm not. I just want to make sure he got the memo. Because, I get down there and step on his head by accident, he's probably not going to take I'm sorry about that. Excuse me. I didn't mean to step on your head, Mr. Alligator. He's probably just going to, do what nature tells him to do. But Brother Alfred was right. God did give man dominion over the animals. In fact, Jesus would even use that analogy when he would talk about your worth to God. He would say, don't you know that you're worth more than many sparrows, and yet not a single sparrow has ever fallen from the sky when God didn't take note of it. And you're worth more than many sparrows. He made man on the last day, and he admired his creation. And he said, it's good and very good. Elder Sylvester Hassel wrote it this way. He created Adam able to stand and liable to fall. That's not Bible, but I think that's a pretty good way to describe how God created Adam. Able to stand. He was a good man and a very good man. God's creation was, shall we say, perfect. And man that caused the problem. But he created that garden and he put the man in it to dress and to keep it. You may say, I have my own father used to have this question for me. Well, if he created man in Genesis chapter 1, who's the other man he created in Genesis chapter 2? My dad's view of that was, he's not here to defend himself, but he would say, he would agree, this was his view of it, was that God created Adam he created a man in Genesis chapter 1, didn't like what he had created, and then he started over in Genesis chapter 2. And I said, well, but Dad, in Genesis chapter 2, it says, there was not a man to till the ground. What happened to the other man? Let me just cut to the chase here. In Genesis chapter 2, at least in part, gives you how in a movie, sometimes a movie will cover, or a book will cover a large span of time, and then at some point, it kind of slows down and you start to, it may cover months or even years. And then at some point in the movie, it actually slows down and shows you a lot of detail about one specific event. That's what Genesis 2 is. Genesis 2 slows things down. It says, okay, here's a breakdown of day number 6. And describes to you in greater detail how God created man. And also how he created woman. And I'll bring this to a close here. I love this article of faith. I don't think I've ever seen this as an article of faith before. But I certainly believe this. I believe the biblical kind of creation. So here's what happened with the man and the woman. So God recognized it was not good for the man that he should dwell alone. And so he had Adam go into a deep sleep. He took a rib out of Adam's side. You say, you believe he really took that rib? Amen, I surely do. And you say, well, I thought that was just allegory. It is. It's both. It both happened, and it's allegorical. It happened, he took that rib, and I'll tell you what, you need to look at it that way. He didn't take a bone out of the foot. He didn't take a bone out of the head. He took a bone out of the side. So she walked beside. It's both allegory and real. But before all that happened, it's interesting to me, God had all the animals to parade before Adam. And it says in verse 19, this is chapter 2, verse 19, and out of the ground the Lord formed every beast of the field, every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. And Adam gave names to all the cattle, and to the fowl of the air, and to every beast of the field. But there's a little clue here. But for Adam there was not found in help meet for him. Was God checking to see if any of the animals would work for what he had in mind? Thank you for the head shake. No, he was not. God did. That's not it. I'll tell you what God was doing there. What God was doing here was he was showing Adam that there's nothing that I have created to this point is sufficient for what I'm going to create for you next. All those animals came by, and none of them fit what God had in mind for Adam's help meet. So why are you separating those words like that? Because the Bible separates. She was a help, and that word meet means appropriate for. She's perfect for him, in other words. She's perfect for him. The perfect complement. And the Lord caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept, and took one of his ribs, and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And again, I believe God's the best surgeon there is. He did that just right there and never even woke Adam up. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man, made he a woman, and brought her unto the man. And you know what? When Adam woke up from that deep sleep he'd been in, you know what the thing he saw right in front of him was? Something he had never seen before. He had never seen anything like it before. He didn't have those animals. This was new. This was something God created, and he created specifically for him. That's why Solomon would say, whoso findeth a wife findeth a good thing. And Adam said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She should be called woman because she was taken out of man. And that's where Adam stops talking. The next phrase is God talking, not Adam. I can prove that because Jesus, when he quoted this, said, he that made them in the beginning, made them male and female, and said, therefore shall a man leave his father and mother, shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And they were both naked, and the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. I believe all that took place on the sixth day. And when the sixth day was completed, the work was finished, and what did God do? He rested on the seventh day. Yes, we believe the biblical account of creation, that God spoke this world into existence, and from that day to this, he has held it by the word of his power. Nothing's ever going to shake it until he shakes it and folds it up like a vesture and puts it away and takes us home to be with him. I thank you very much for your very good attention this morning. We will publish the open doors of the church. Does anyone have a number that would be suitable for that?
177.
Which one?
177.
177. We're 177. On the first verse, if you'd like to join the church, make your desires known. On the second verse, we'll shake hands with one another. We're 177. Go ahead, Paul.
This is my Father's will, and to my listening ears, all nature sings and round me rings the music of the spheres. This is my Father's will. I rest me in the thought of rocks and trees, of skies and seas. His hands the wonders wrought. This is my Father's world. And the carols raise, the morning light, the lily white, declare their Maker's praise. This is my Father's world. He shines in all that's fair. In the rustling grass I hear him pass. He speaks to me everywhere. This is my Father's world. Oh, let me therefore forget that though the wrong seems all so strong, God is a ruler yet. This is my Father's world. The battle is not done. Jesus who died shall be satisfied, and earth and heaven